Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum Homecoming. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, we've talked at length, of course, about the fundamental idea that the valuation of ETH will ultimately return home to the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. Okay? This is a thesis. Now, within a given thesis, right, there's no guarantee that it pans out how we might expect. There's no guarantee. But I still will remain true to my conviction that ultimately, before we can achieve the conditions necessary to send Ether to new highs, what I think is that we first must visit the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. The reason for this is throughout the context of history, this is exactly what we've seen. You can see that back in 2015, we came down here to the regression trend line and then moved higher. And then in 2016, we ultimately faded into it. And then once we tagged the lower part of it, we moved higher. And then even in 2018, all the way down to 2019, 2020, you can see that all the way over here in late 2019, we tagged it. And then we, of course, got the very brief recession that sent us lower, okay? And then we moved higher. And so the thesis, and we've had this thesis for, basically for a year and a half now, since Q1 of 2022, that Ethereum should, and in my opinion, will likely eventually return home. Now, the definition of where home is obviously constantly changing, okay? Because again, this assumes that the fair value of Ethereum increases like a monotonic function, right? Therefore, the fair value is always going up, even if the price of the underlying asset is not always going up. And the reason for that, of course, is because we go through bubbles where we're overvalued for a while, and we go through, pretty bad bear market years where we're undervalued for a while, and so on and so forth. So the idea, again, is that Ethereum will eventually return home to the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. Now, the middle part of this band, just to give you a number, is currently at $934. $934. The lower part of the band is at $644. $644. Okay? Remember, last cycle, we actually went below the band. Okay? And to the tune of 31% below it. Actually, maybe slightly more if I get this all the way down to that wick. About a 33% drop below the band. A 33% drop below this band here, where it currently is, would put ETH at around $400. Okay? Now, I said a long time ago that what I would consider to be a fairly attractive accumulation range for my consideration, right? For my consideration, not necessarily for you, but what I would consider a fairly attractive level would be that $400 to $600 range, because it would essentially be, in the lower part of the regression band. Now, that does not mean that, you need to follow that in terms of an accumulation strategy for ETH. There's no guarantee anything that I say in this video will actually pan out. We must remember that as many times as I put out a theory about something, there are some that do not come true. And so there's a consideration there that you have to make, right? I mean, there's definitely narratives that will support another view, and I think it's probably wise for you to ultimately take those narratives into consideration. But I would also argue that the narratives that will only ever tell you up only, they're only ever going to tell you to buy the dip. And so I was hoping in this video to provide a different perspective to allow you to see the market in a slightly different way. So the idea, as we've said, is that Ethereum eventually returns home before going into another bull market to eventually take ETH to new all-time highs. There is a seasonality aspect of this that we are entering now, which should likely not be favorable for Ether for the rest of the year. If we were to go take a look at the year-to-date ROI of ETH, which we have followed quite closely for the duration of this year, we have said over and over and over again that there is a very high chance that ETH will close the year below the yearly open, just like it did in 2019. Now remember, in 2019, Bitcoin did not close the year below the yearly open, right? It closed the year up almost 2x from the yearly open. And despite the fact that despite the fact that Bitcoin went up 2x from yearly open to yearly close in 2019, or almost 2x, Ethereum in 2019 closed the year below where it opened it, about 7% down or so. So then that raises the question, well, if Ethereum is to follow what it did in 2019, and you can see this drop here came almost at the exact same time. One of the reasons that we didn't really get a lot of volatility for the last several months is because we didn't get that, that final move to the upside. And therefore, because we didn't get that impulsive move higher, we never got the volatility that came with it to get us back down to these levels. And so instead of doing that, instead of going up and then coming back down, we basically just went sideways until now we've reached the phase of the market cycle where it's really an unfavorable time for Ether on its USD pair. And you can see that it's dropped here right when it did last cycle. But furthermore, you can see that as the year goes on, there is a good chance that Ethereum could continue to fall on its USD valuation. And if it were to close the year below the yearly open, just to give you an idea of what the yearly open was for Ethereum, the yearly open was actually at $1,195. So the argument being that there is, in my opinion, a very high probability that ETH closes the year below its yearly open. Look at this 2019 candle. Look at it, right? It started off, we went up, and then ultimately we came back down, and it closed the year below the yearly open. Year-to-date ROI, right? You can see that it came down here and then moved a little bit back up, and then it also had faded here at the beginning of the year as well. But again, you can see that it was ultimately a red candle in 2019. And so if we were just to repeat the context of history, then ETH could easily go to the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. The upper part of the trend line is currently at $1,353, right? So it wouldn't even be that difficult for us to enter into the top part of this band. I mean, if you draw a trend line here, just sort of connecting the dots, you can see that if we just simply fade below this and get some type of capitulation here into the back part of the year, which I think is a high likelihood, then that gets you well into that regression band and it takes Ethereum home. And I think that, as investors, we must consider the downside risk, okay? As much as it'd be so much easier for me to just post bullish stuff all the time, believe me, I get a lot more views for sure, and I wouldn't get dunked on Twitter nearly as much. But what I found though, is that if you're bullish and you're wrong, a lot of people are much more forgiving. If you're bearish and you're wrong, you just get dunked on, right? I've experienced this many times. And of course, the definition of being wrong is up for debate. I mean, it's all a matter of time, what your time frame is as to whether you would perceive something as wrong or not. But there is still a high probability, in my opinion, right, that ETH capitulates below this and comes back into this level, just like it did last cycle, right? It's not like it's some huge conspiracy theory, right? It's exactly what it did last cycle, and it came back down. And if you were to look at monthly returns of Ether, let's go look at Ether first here. In 2019, you can see that there were some pretty negative months here for Ether in the back half of 2019. August was negative 21%. in 2019. We're currently looking at negative 10% so far. September and October weren't so bad for ETH. But then November was negative 17%, December negative 15%. 2020, we got a couple of green months and then negative 39%. I still think there is a lot of downside risk and we must be prepared for it. We still have to go through the uninversion of the yield curve. We still have to get to the point where the Fed is willing to pivot, and we just simply are not there at this time. You can also look at the Ether Bitcoin valuation and see that we're in very unfavorable territory right now on average for the Ether Bitcoin pair. And yes, August is up 0.5%, but you know that this stuff can change very quickly, okay? So, and we still have about a week and a half to go in the month. We'll see where it ends up closing, but we also know that the market can move incredibly quickly whenever it decides to move. So let's keep an eye on that. Something else that I think is at least worthwhile to keep in the back of your mind is that we've talked a lot about net liquidity, right? Net liquidity. And the idea is that it basically tracks just the balance sheet of the various central banks, including the United States, right? The Fed, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, and Japan, the ECB, and the United Kingdom. And it tracks all those and it subtracts out the TGA and the reverse repo. You get something that looks like this. Now, what's interesting with this chart is that it actually tracks, sorry, I need to clean this up a little bit. It actually tracks total 3 incredibly well. Okay, incredibly well. So let's go take a look. If you were to move this, the total 3 does not include ETH, just as a reminder. Okay, so if you look at total 3, and you overlay total 3 here with net liquidity, you can see, right, I guess I need to make this log scale. You can see that it matches up pretty well, right? As excess liquidity goes down, so too does the altcoin market. Now, there's this idea that what if, and I know this is getting a little bit out there, so let's just take this one step at a time and not take it to the bank. But I want us to consider one thing, okay, one thing here. And that is what if you were to look at where the valuation of Ether was over here when net liquidity was at the same level that it's at today, okay? The valuation of ETH was around $400 to $500. $400 to $500 when net liquidity was this level in 2020. $400 to $500, which is equivalent to the 2019 high. That's a pretty big drop, okay? There's no guarantee we have to go that low. If you look at the context of history, you'll see that, there's times where net liquidity is low and all you have to do is see the money printers turn back on and the market will just shoot back up. So there's no guarantee the market goes on long enough to reach those valuations. But there is a possibility that Ethereum could fade back down to a double bottom at the very least, and I think a reasonable chance at a lower low. I think if there's a reasonable chance that ETH sees a lower low. And if that happens, I think it's worthwhile to be prepared. One interesting thing, and I've talked about this a few times, is if you go take a look at the NASDAQ. So let's pull up the NASDAQ. This is kind of one of those things where it's like, is it really worthwhile to make this comparison as closely as we're making it? Probably not. But I find it fascinating to some degree that the NASDAQ during the dot-com crash peaked at 4,800. The high, if you zoom in here, the high was right here, and it reached 48.16. 48.16. Ethereum peaked at 48.67. The low for the NASDAQ occurred at 795. Ethereum's low so far is 880. So what if ETH were to go to around 795? That would put it 795 in the context of the lower logarithmic regression band. 795 would put you right around here. That's what the NASDAQ did. By the way, when the NASDAQ did that, it took a long time to see that play out. From the high, it took 133 weeks to see that devaluation. 133 weeks. From Ether's high, here, 133 weeks would put you, from this high right here, 133 weeks. Let me scroll over here. But 133 would put you all the way out in May of 2024. Now, I hope it doesn't take that long, right? I hope it doesn't take that long, because that's actually after the Bitcoin halving. And that wouldn't really be a whole lot of fun if things go south after the halving. But it's something that we, of course, have to consider. And hopefully, if we're going to go home, which I think we're going to do, hopefully it happens before the halving, right? For Bitcoin, of course. But again, I mean, this shows you that sometimes it takes a long time for the market to unwind. And, you know, there's always a chance as well that you get some type of 2020 scenario where it's like basically a higher low. I mean, this was more or less a double bottom for ETH. I mean, you know, the low over here was like, what, $80, and then the low over here was 89. I mean, it's more or less a double bottom. There's a chance that you could see something like that play out, where it falls back into that $800 to $900 range rather than going below $800. But it is at least a worthwhile consideration to make, considering that the NASDAQ took 2.5 years to ultimately find that low. It's worthwhile to consider because in terms of seasonality, Ethereum is in unfavorable waters right now, and you can see that it's dropping the same time it did in 2019. And if it follows 2019, then it means we're probably going to get another drop relatively soon, maybe to take us down to the $1,400 range. Okay? Then maybe you get a pump back up only to eventually fade it again. So, considering that the NASDAQ did it during the dot-com crash, considering that the year-to-date ROI is now in unfavorable territory for ETH, and history shows us that in the pre-halving year, Ethereum could close the year below its yearly open, which would put it below $1,200 sometime later on this year. Because when you look at Ether Bitcoin's valuation, we know that it's an unfavorable time from now until, and from June really until the end of the year. We know it's unfavorable time for ETH. And when you go look at Bitcoin potentially here is in a downtrend, right? And we talked about this a long time, that normally it's the S&P 500 that knocks Bitcoin off of its 20-week SMA in August or September of the pre-election year, right? Remember that, right? The S&P 500, this correction here, just like in 2019, just like in 2015, just like in 2011, knocks Bitcoin off of its support level in August or September of the pre-halving year, right? Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, and now Exhibit D, right? Every August or September, we see Ether or see Bitcoin drop below its 20-week SMA and get a weekly close below it because of this seasonal correction by the S&P 500. The issue is that while the S&P could theoretically go higher eventually, even maybe later this year, Bitcoin, even in that environment where the S&P goes higher, would likely stay in a downtrend, because that's what happened in 2019 as well, right? Take a look at the S&P in 2019, and you can see that after this, after the S&P got this seasonal correction to drop Bitcoin below its 20-week, the S&P put in new highs, but Bitcoin just put in lower highs, right, and lower lows. And there's no guarantee that the S&P pushes higher if we end up getting a recession. So I would argue that Bitcoin has likely started its secondary scare. We did a video about that not too long ago, which involves a process that could last from anywhere to two weeks to like 6 months based on what history shows us. Okay, and again, I don't make it that be the range. That's just what we've previously seen, about 2 weeks to 6 months, and probably longer than 2 weeks. Maybe it doesn't have to be quite 6 months. But if Bitcoin is in a downtrend and Ether Bitcoin is not in favorable territory, that means that Ether has to go down faster than Bitcoin in that environment. And if Ether goes, if Ethereum underperforms Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is going down, then of course that means that Ethereum is going down quicker. And you can see exactly how it might play out. So yes, I know I'm stubborn about this, but I've been stubborn about a lot of things this cycle, and a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have ultimately come to pass, right? Altcoins have ultimately pushed lower. The dominance of Bitcoin, I know it's on a pullback right now, but it has gone up a lot over the last year or two. We've seen altcoins against Bitcoin drop down. I've argued with countless people on Twitter about the Ether Bitcoin valuation, but there's still no denying the fact that this is just a series of lower highs and lower lows. Okay, and that's all it's been all year, and really since the merge, and really since December 2021, and really since 2017. Lower highs. Also gotten some higher lows as well. But I still would contend that whether you want to point towards, if you want to be optimistic and point towards the higher lows, you're still likely going to see this fall back in and then be a higher low from there, right? If you want to be optimistic about it being a higher low, there's always a chance that it's turned into an oscillator as well. But we must consider this. There's also this 20-month moving average that we've talked about a few times, and I don't really bring it up every time I talk about it, but it is at least something that I think is worthwhile to remind ourselves of. Is this 20-month SMA? Over here we were getting rejected by it for a little bit, and I was very bullish on it. I said we're going to break above it, and we did. And then we came back down and held it as support, and then off to the races. Now it's the opposite. We break down, back test it as resistance, and then we go this way. And if that occurs in a Bitcoin USD downtrend, then that means Ethereum's capitulating. And if Ethereum capitulates, that means Ethereum is likely heading home. Homecoming. And hopefully it comes home soon, because I'm running out of titles here to call this. If you look at the bull market support band, which is the 20-week SMA, the 21-week EMA, you can see that Ethereum dropped below it around this July-August timeframe in 2019. And again, here, this July-August timeframe. I mean, if you zoom in, you can see that we were already getting weekly closes below the 20-week moving average, right? We had a weekly close right here below the 20-week SMA, a weekly close right here below the 20-week SMA. Both of them, though, were above the 21-week EMA. This one has, a good chance of closing below the 20-week SMA unless there's some type of sizable rally between now and the weekly close, although that doesn't seem like the most realistic or likely outcome. But again, anything's possible. So the cycle seems to be repeating, right? We seem to be fading at around the same time we did last cycle. Think about how many people have just been posting up only, and everything's just, they tell you that everything's bullish. And then when it drops, they just say buy the dip. But the issue is that and I've said this many times, in pre-halving years for Bitcoin, we go up long enough to lull the bulls into a false sense of security. I say this because I have fallen into it, not because I'm, trying to appear like I know it, like I know what has to happen. I've experienced it in prior cycles when I thought that I knew, that I thought that this was just ultimately bullish and was not going to come back down. And then we got wrecked, absolutely wrecked. So I say to you today, I come to you as humbly as I can because I have been wrecked in prior cycles because I thought the same thing that a lot of people have thought this cycle, right? Where people say new all-time highs are coming this year, and that this cycle is going to be different, and that the peak is going to come, a lot sooner. And then it doesn't. And then those calls just sort of fade into the depths of the cryptoverse as the people that buy the dip realize that buying the dip in the second half of the pre-halving year can take a lot longer to be profitable. It doesn't mean that it can't eventually be profitable. I mean, I am long-term bullish on ETH, believe it or not, though I know a lot of people might not believe that. But, you know, I just remember buying the dip over here, and we just watched it go lower and lower and lower and lower. And here's another interesting thing. How far do you think Ether dropped from the 20-week last cycle? Not even from the peak of 2019, just from the 20-week. It fell 60%. A 60% drop from this 20-week would put you at $700, between $700 to $800. So, you know, I think there's a chance that Ethereum does eventually go home, that it goes to, my guess is that we could see that $700 to $800 range. Worst case is that it goes a little bit lower than that. Worst case. That $400 to $600 range would likely be what I would consider to be an accumulation phase of a lifetime, if other conditions allow for me to call it that. It's possible that it could correspond to slightly higher prices as well, but it's all going to depend on how things unfold with the inverted yield curve, the Bitcoin dominance, the altcoin reckoning, etc. The other thing that I wanted to mention is if you look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, so this actually includes ETH. We've looked at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. This one actually includes Ethereum. And you can see that it's basically just coming back up to the bull market support band, right? In this case, a bear market resistance band. And I would argue there's a good chance that it just simply gets rejected, right? We actually had a rally back over here that ultimately topped out around this level, around 0.87, 0.88, 0.89. We're currently at 0.87. Note that the 20-week estimated 21-week EMA is at 0.89 to 0.9. Which is interesting because that's the same level that we got rejected at over here before capitulating down to a new low. So, I say, if this is coming, you better, you know, it's best to be prepared for it. You know, people can mock the views all they want to, but a lot of times what I find is that people like to dunk on the views, and then when, you know, are on the views that I have, and then oftentimes we've seen it play out, especially with the altcoin market over the last 18 months, and then they just say buy the dip again, right? You know, I mean, how long? I mean, how, you know, the issue is that people just buy the dip and they keep doing it, and then they run out of money. And then they end up having to capitulate because they can't afford their, you know, some living expenses, and they end up capitulating the bottom. So you have to be careful with the buy the dip strategy, especially in the altcoin market. With Bitcoin and Ethereum, it has been a generally good play over the long haul. With the altcoin market, it's really hit or miss. So at least do consider that. I think that is mostly covered what I wanted to talk about in this video. My general view is that Ethereum is heading home. $700-800 seems like a reasonable area. $400 to $600 is really that sweet spot. It would provide a lot of value if we went to that region, and we'll take it, we'll take it one day at a time. I can't possibly know exactly how low it will go, but I do think we have entered into the season. And as you can see, right, this capitulation here below the 20-week estimate, I think we've entered into a downtrend, and no one knows how deep this will ultimately go. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you next time. Bye.